Doug, how would you recommend Christians think about revisionist history? As I think about all the implications of the post-war consensus, I'm eager to find literature that swims against the post-war river. Any recommendations or warnings for me in my research?
This whole post-war consensus thing.
Can you summarize that?
Yeah. The post-World War II is when our federal courts and the liberal secular establishment started gradually whiting out America's Christian heritage.
Okay.
Right. We were self-consciously a Christian people down to the Second World War.
Uh-huh.
Okay. FDR could speak as we are a Christian people, and did. That doesn't mean that he was an evangelical. I'm just talking about the
cultural assumptions.
The cultural assumption. And in 1892, there was a Supreme Court decision, Holy Trinity versus the United States, that determined we are, in fact, a Christian nation. That was part of our cultural heritage. After the Second World War, secularism began feeling its oats, and federal judges started rewriting history.
Why does World War II play that role?
I think World War II is a good marker. It's roughly when it happened. But I think that the thing that set us up for this was we were the king of the world.
Okay.
We
emerged as the one on top.
We were the great hegemon. Mm-hmm. We're number one. Our country was intact. Our industrial might was intact. Mm-hmm. Our navy was intact. Everything was, and Europe was in ruins, and Asia was, the rest of the world is where the war was fought. And so we were the king of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And it's very easy when you're Nebuchadnezzar to look at the city and say, is this not great Babylon that I built? Mm-hmm. And then you descend into madness, which is precisely what we've done. So the whole the post-war consensus was a liberal, secular, we don't need God consensus. And they began to erase Christ and God from our history in court decisions. And that's when Thomas Jefferson's phrase in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, the wall of separation between church and state, that's when that phrase starts showing up in court decisions as though the Constitution put a wall of separation between church and state, which it didn't. That was an anachronistic reading of American history. So that's the liberal post-war consensus. And many modern Christians who are trying to defend the Constitution have accepted the framing of, well, the founders were deists. No, they weren't.
Okay.
No, they weren't deists. There were two quasi-deists among them, notable, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And they were bad deists because they both believed that God intervened in human affairs.
Okay.
And Thomas Jefferson was in France when the Constitution was adopted, and Benjamin Franklin was an inconsistent deist. And at the Constitutional Convention, there were 55 men there. 50 of them were Orthodox Trinitarians. 50 out of the 55. And we have people saying, well, the founders were deists. Mm-hmm. That's just a lie. It's just wrong. It's just a lie. Now, the problem is we've got a number of people online who are, so that revisionist history in a secular liberal direction was historically ignorant, okay? We have had the rise online of groypers and what I call dank right types who say that Hitler was the last Christian prince, and we were on the wrong side in the Second World War, and that group loves to assail the post-war consensus and wants to say that Jews are running the world, and anybody who thinks that Israel has a point in their conflict with Iran is in the under the Jews' thumb, and and then has bought into the post-war consensus. Well, you don't want to basically you want to get informed on what American history actually was, right? What actually happened, and you'll discover that it owes nothing whatever to to praising people like Hitler.
Right.
Right. So I would say the thing to do would be to I'll just recommend a few books.
Okay.
And one is by Greg Singer called A Theological Interpretation of American History. And it's just very good. We have the downgrade. Harvard was captured by the Unitarians in 1805, for example, and it basically goes into early American history, but it looks at it through a theological grid.
Okay.
Okay. Greg Singer, Theological Interpretation of American History. I would recommend two books by Rush Dooney. One is This Independent Republic, and the other is The Nature of the American System.
Okay.
This Independent Republic and The Nature of the American System are both, and I don't know if Singer was a Reconstructionist, but Rush Dooney was. But Rush Dooney's early works are really historically informed. He's really well read and on point. It's just good. It's just good stuff. Then there are some popular level things. Gary DeMar wrote a book called America's Christian History. There's an intelligent design guy whose name begins with last name begins with a D. Anyway,
That guy.
You track that guy.
Yeah.
He did one on America's Christian history. Another book that you can find probably online. It's a little booklet. It's called The French and American Revolutions Compared.
Okay.
By Friedrich Gentz, a German guy. It was translated from German into English by John Quincy Adams. Okay, so it was very early on.
Yeah.
John Quincy Adams translated it, and it shows you that Adams, our future U.S. president, was saying our revolution was nothing at all like the French Revolution. So I would read histories. I wouldn't gravitate to revisionist histories that were written 2 years ago. Right?
Why is that?
Well, because you're probably dealing with someone who just wants to outrage people, or you're running a risk of having them be the dank right, or they've got an agenda, they've got a current political agenda. If you find a book that was written in 1938 on America's Christian history, that's the kind of thing that you would want. And Rush Dooney and Singer and people like that owe nothing at all. They're obligated in no way to the post-war consensus.
Where do you put Return of the Strong Gods in that list?
I would put Return of the Strong Gods by Reno in the category of sociological observation.
Okay.
Not so much history, right?
Yeah.
And I think as a sociological observation, it's dead on, right?
Okay.
It's right on. He's explaining why people grab on, why everybody's reacting the way they are. Because secular liberal democracy in the post-war era just became effeminate. It just and it has spiraled down into homosexuality and the trans stuff. It's just and then people can't take that for very long, and there's been a recoil, and that's what Reno is predicting: the reaction against all that fluff in the Return of the Strong Gods.
He says he asks here for recommendations or warnings. I'm wondering, are there certain tropes or threads that you think are particularly threatening, where you would say, you start hearing this, everybody just get out of the pool. That's not going to be a helpful thread to go down.
Yeah, this next point I'm going to make is going to be really easy to misrepresent.
Okay.
But if someone...
You never do that.
No, that's I'm just letting you know that I'm aware that it's going to happen beforehand. But if someone is talking or writing and every third sentence somehow bends back around to the Jews...
Yeah,
that's a
dangerous
Jews
on the
sign.
brain. Then.
Now, of course, we're Christians. We believe in total depravity, and we don't believe the Jews were exempt from total depravity. And we know that the Jews did not confess Christ, who is the only solution to sin. So I'm not saying that the Jews aren't sinners, But the way I understand anti-Semitism is not the belief that Jews are sinners in need of salvation, because every Orthodox Christian believes that, and some in the Anti-Defamation League would say, and every Christian is anti-Semitic because of that. But that's just Orthodox Christianity. Anti-Semitism is when you believe that the Jews are uniquely malevolent, that they're the cancer of the planet, that they're wrecking everything. And that we just have no basis for thinking that. Now, I think we do have a basis for thinking, and people will come back and say, "Well, explain all the Jewish involvement in all these tawdry things," right? And I think you do have to explain that. But the Jews being uniquely malevolent is not the explanation. The Jews are a talented people for a number of reasons, I think having to do with their isolation in various ways, the text-based education that they've insisted on for their children, the high standards, my son the doctor, my son the lawyer, that they just are people who excel. So you've got that means you've got the ordinary bell curve, and Jews will have a disproportionate number of people rising to positions of authority in corrupt, toxic organizations, just as you will have a disproportionate number of them winning Nobel Prizes in medicine or brain surgery or inventors or world-class violinists. They excel, and there are Jews who excel in civilization affirming ways, things that we appreciate, and then there are the people, the pornographers and the Bolsheviks and the people doing awful things. And you can't refute the point I'm making by pointing to the Bolsheviks, because I say, yeah, I know about them. Yeah, I grant that.
Yeah.
Now, will you grant the guy who developed the patent on those medicines you're taking? And they never want to do that.
Are there any other threads besides the anti-Semitism that you'd say I see these things commonly in this sort of dank right world that are disturbing?
Yeah, another danger sign would be egalitarianism, right-wing egalitarianism, and this is we just have to think like adults in all this, because there's always a but there's always a ditch on both sides of the road. But in the wild popularity of that song, Richmond, North of Richmond, is basically the lament of the Rust Belt, the populist revolt that put Donald Trump in power. A lot of that was driven by class envy. Right now, and I'm not saying that the people who complained about the Richmond, North of Richmond, who are bureaucrats making their money not off of honest industry, but making their money off of shutting down coal mines in West Virginia.
Sure.
Right. So there is, even when the populist uprising has a legitimate political point, oftentimes the egginess is egalitarian, and Christians have to be enemies of every form of egalitarianism, whether right wing or left wing.